Hello and welcome to a new video. In this one I'm going to be going through the concept art for Scorn and talking about some of the things I've noticed about them. So let's begin. This first one, despite being incredibly decayed, is the best view we have of the main character. A complete frontal shot of its face, and it's quite evident. You can see that it looks sort of human, but not quite. It doesn't have ears, and even more noticeably doesn't have a regular mouth. Some time ago, someone on Tumblr edited some other concept art for Scorn Guy here to give an approximation of what the character would look like without being horribly decayed. But there's not much that can be gained from this without focusing on some of the other and older concept arts for the character. According to the lead developer, the first thing they tried to figure out was what the main character would look like, and this is one of the earliest concepts when they were trying to figure out what they want to do and what they didn't want to do. And I think you might already notice some similarities. First of all, the character always lacked a mouth and seemed to have these extensions, whether they're engravings into his face or some fleshy cord stemming from his nose. Another thing about this picture here is the eyes, which look almost mechanical, I think. They look sort of like metal with blue lights in the center, or in the case of the far left, an orange light. Now the actual concept art for Scorn Guy, well, not the actual concept art, but the version that we know today that we're going to be playing as, has blue eyes, and that'll be shown later on. But I'm wondering if the new Scorn Guy has mechanical eyes, assuming that observation is at all correct, or not. But in further concept arts, I'll show that there's a bit more to this character than just flesh. A final observation, well, not the final one, I have two more. The second final, the penultimate, is that the character always had sort of red flesh wrapping around its temples and cheeks, which you saw in the Tumblr recreation and will be seeing in official concept art later. And also what the character wears has always been this sort of fleshy drape that curves around the back of his neck and forms a sort of V pattern down to its chest. So, despite being very early and a lot of changes made, you can see they had an idea, even as far back then, of what they wanted this guy to look like. The next concept art is actually a really good one because it shows a side-by-side between an early version of Scorn Guy on the left and the current one on the right, and sort of shows how the whole design of it changed over time. So you can see that both of them have this organic looking helmet, the one on the left having more mechanical parts, the one on the right being mostly just organic without any mechanical looking parts. Both of them feature some sort of tubing wrapping close around its neck, but for the newer version there's also this tentacle that stems down, going near its lungs. The one on the left had much smoother I guess you can say clothing or armor, while the one on the right really just does look like it was made from skin or something, and has these weird tumor-looking growths around its lungs. The lungs for the one on the left are lower down and appear to be damaged actually, with something sticking out of it or in it, while the one on the right, the lungs are higher up and seem undamaged as far as I can tell. But in both cases, it sort of looks like the clothing or armor has fused in with the character's arms. This concept art shows the back of the old version of Scorn guy. He's in some sort of environment that seems to be decaying away at his body, starting at the very tips of his fingers and the back of his hand. Not exactly sure what sort of environment this is supposed to be, if it's supposed to be on the surface of the planet or just some room in general, but this sort of gives an idea of what I meant with the whole its clothing or armor was fused in with its skin. The old armor looked incredibly mechanical, maybe some sort of stone or metal, and having these holes in it that looks like where screws would be inserted into in like an action figure or something. It's also worth noting that the red part wrapping around his face was smooth and unbroken. The new concept art for the current version of Scorn guy is quite a bit different at first glance. There's no holes in it, and it's not made of metal. And the red part of his head isn't solid. It's sort of broken up in what kind of resembles skin cells if you look at them under a microscope. And still there's some design similarities, like the fact that the part around its neck, his neck there, extends upward and just really wraps around the back of its neck. And also the back has these ridges along it similar to a spinal cord. And here's a close-up of Scorn guy's head where you can see he has blue pupils for eyes, and from his nose is this engraving that shows he doesn't have an actual mouth. The scene in the teaser trailer, the reveal trailer of that humanoid guy waking up in that flesh wall, looking around for a few seconds and then going back to sleep, I think is supposed to be Scorn guy or the same species. But what's interesting about those scenes, if you go back and watch them, is they do as much as they can to sort of hide the mouth area. You can see its nose, you can see its eyes, you can see that the red part of its face really is broken up fleshy mass, but you can't see its mouth. For whatever reason, that was something they tried to hide away from the viewers during their first depiction of his head in the game itself. Here's a bit of development history for you based on the concept arts. Originally, the Scorn team tried to appeal to Sony for financial backing in order to make the game, and one of the concept arts they had drawn was of Scorn guy wearing the PlayStation VR helmet. And you can sort of see that the organic helmet, the tentacle thing wrapping around the neck, isn't actually part of Scorn guy, but is a separate thing. And you also get a better view of some strange part of him below his chin. I actually have no idea what that's supposed to be. But that's early concept art, and then when they made their new Kickstarter and were planning things after they got publishing, they made new concept art of Scorn Guy with some new VR equipment. The one in the middle is especially funny since it's sort of like a Scorn version of a VR helmet. One thing we have for the early concept of the organic helmet that we don't have for the newer ones is a back view, where you can see it's incredibly asymmetrical. There's all these wires and tentacles and whatever running down it, and it seems to be really ingrained into his body, with the back part looking like it's just shoved straight into the back of its skull. And it's worth pointing out that the front view is fairly asymmetrical. There's a bit on the left side that's really close to his eyes that sort of sticks out. And that was actually carried over to the new version, with the bit on the left completely across from his eyes, sticking out more than the same area on the right. And I should mention now that it's our left and right and not Scorn Guy's. A final big difference is that the helmet in the new version also wraps around his chin, where the old version left that completely exposed to the elements. As we move away from talking about Scorn Guy himself, I'd like to draw some attention to this collection of abandoned ideas, ones that just didn't make the cut. You can see when they were trying to start to plan this out, they went pretty wild with some of their ideas. Half of these kind of look like the crew of the Flying Dutchman in the Pirates of the Caribbean films. But you can see most of the top row and the very last one has his lower half and especially his chin exposed, which seems to indicate that the helmet idea was always meant to protect his eyes somehow. I wonder if that might be somehow related to the ceiling penis in the demo that seems to blind the character and affects his vision and thus cause him to die. You can also see all of these helmet ideas looked really ingrained with his body wrapping around his neck in some way in most of them. And like the penultimate one, number 8, is just very odd because of its incredible symmetry, which isn't really shown in any of the other ones except maybe number 3. But in all the other ones, the helmets were very, I'd say, asymmetrical in many ways. But these are, as far as we know, I think mentioned in the article, the interview with the lead developer, that this picture can be found in the failed ideas. So there's not too much to speculate on here. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Didn't you just say we're moving away from Scorn Guy? And we are. I'm making the argument that this person here isn't Scorn Guy, but instead this is some bit of evidence that we will find other Scorn people of the same species as Scorn Guy in the game. This particular concept art is a bit interesting and reveals actually quite a lot. First of all, it shows again some decaying process similar to the frontal view of Scorn Guy that I started out with, but also shows a lot of mechanical parts wrapping around his head, pretty similar to the organic helmet that I showed off earlier on. Now, we know that Scorn people don't seem to have too much of an issue with embedding technology deep into their flesh. In the demo, what the first thing you're supposed to do is find a machine to stick your arm in and have some keyblade thing embedded into you. And in the video where I talk about some observations about the world of Scorn, I mentioned that a lot of the machines seem to be activated using just shoving your arms into it and manipulating it that way. So this sort of filter looking thing here, which is very, I guess, difficult maybe on YouTube to see, but it's on the Kickstarter page, so you can find it yourself and download it to your computer and adjust the brightness, is pretty clearly like boring in to the character's face at the mouth area. And there's these holes on the side that kind of look like wires or tubing are supposed to stick into it. So I have a theory that Scorn people aren't all organic. In fact, they might even be mechanical with an organic covering over them. On the game character, if you follow the line between his lungs down, during the first or second sort of rib area, you'll see this, it's actually kind of hard to see, but sort of circle around where some part of it was broken off somehow, and that part there kind of looks metal in my opinion, but that's fairly flimsy evidence though. The gun has remained fairly consistent throughout the development actually. The color scheme is a little bit different, sure, but it's still very recognizable as the handgun that you play with in the demo. But of course there are some big differences, most notably the tentacle coming out from the back. There's two of them, one from the lower part of the gun that attaches to Scorn Guy's wrist, and a much larger tentacle that attaches to who knows. If I recall correctly, this was changed not because of any artistic reasons, but because it was very difficult to actually implement in-game. Because of this change, however, there's a few big differences between, or not big differences, smaller differences between the gun in this concept art and the one that can be found in the demo and the trailers. One of the things is this sort of mechanism on top that may be the arming or safety mechanism for the gun that's missing from its model in the game and trailer. Another difference between the trailer gun and even the concept art gun and even the trailer gun is around the barrel that the bullets actually fire out of. On the bottom is this two-pronged fork part that just seems to be completely missing from what we ended up with. Like, it's even in the reveal trailer, but missing from the demo and the game model in the game's files. A final difference that I've noticed is, I think originally, because the tentacle was going into Scorn Guy, that would be how he sort of controls the firing of the gun. Like maybe his muscle twitches or his brain sends signals to the gun to fire. But because that's removed, they added a much more conventional trigger to the gun. And here's a picture of it from the trailer to cross-compare. Here's one of the creatures shown off in the trailer. What I want you to pay attention to here are the really fatty parts wrapping around its shoulder and neck. Sort of similar actually to the way Scorn Guy's own clothing wraps around him. And also his mouth area, which also similar to Scorn Guy, features some engraved part of his face stemming down from his nostrils into a mouth area, which in this case is an actual mouth area. And the reason I wanted you to pay attention to those parts is because that's what's shown along with the rest of its body in one of the concept arts the developers have posted. Now the ones they've posted was an animated GIF showing the creature decaying, but I'm going to show each part with just regular pictures, each state of its decaying. Now this is a bit of an interesting picture because we don't really know what role that creature will take in the Scorn universe. It looks scary, so I think we all assume it's going to be some sort of enemy or even a boss fight. And yet, straight up, the Scorn devs seem to be revealing that it's going to die. The top of its head is going to be ripped off. And you can see the mouth area, you can see the part of its face that has the engravings or cuts into it stemming from the nostrils and the real fatty parts wrapping around it. You can also see that it has 3 fingers rather than the 5 that Scorn Guy has. So despite being sort of similar structure to Scorn Guy in the sense it's a biped with eyes, a nose, and a mouth, it isn't exactly the same. Maybe it's some sort of creature engineered by the Scorn people, or some different species similar to them that also evolved alongside them. Not much is really known, and we can also see the color scheme in the concept art is a little different than the one in the reveal trailer. What I'm really curious about here are the holes in its body that seem to be leaking out dark fluids. One would immediately think they're some sort of gunshot wounds. However, they seem to be very consistent on its body. There's 3 of them on each fold. Well, there's 2 layers of them, and then there's 3 running along them. So I'm wondering, does he leak out this fluid consistently, or is it something he leaks out when he dies? The stuff leaking out from him is a little bit darker than the blood leaking out on his top arm there, actually. And of course there's his flesh, which just doesn't even really correspond to any organs we're aware of. Like, I can assume it's probably his brain or something, but it kind of looks like in this case he doesn't have a skull, actually, or we'd see some sort of evidence of that, but he's just this really massive, or maybe just tiny, however big he is, sack of meat without any actual skeletal structures, at least in the top of its head. I mean, it has teeth, it has claws, who knows? Over time, the creature decays a little bit more, its skin becomes flakier as it breaks apart, but ultimately it's still very recognizable as that specific creature. And then it really starts to break down and actually very much resembles a structure you might find in a Beksinski painting, where it looks more like coral or meshwork rather than a solid creature. But still, if you pay close enough attention to it, you'll still recognize it as that creature. It actually resembles a state of decay a lot of the bears in the demo are in. And then finally, it's just completely unrecognizable. What's kind of interesting to me about the way creatures decay in the Scorn world, which we've seen with the bears in the demo, if you walk around and pay attention to the parts of the fleshy masses that are especially prominent, you'll see the husks and corpses of those creatures in various states of decay. But these creatures don't decay down with their flesh being stripped away and then leaving behind a skeleton like life here on Earth. Instead, it looks like, assuming this really is a final step of decay for Scorn creatures, the insides dry out and solidify, and whatever outsides are around or haven't decayed completely also sort of solidify and petrify, leaving behind a very, very generalized form of what it used to be. You can't really recognize any features on the creature anymore. You can't really point to an area if you just stumbled across this and say, yep, that's definitely where the arm is, or there's where the mouth was, without the previous context of the steps I showed before, which again is very different from organic life on Earth. And I'm assuming these creatures are supposed to be a bit closer to how humans are than, say, insects, where humans have endoskeletons, bones inside our body that are left when we die and rot away, rather than insects which have exoskeletons. So that's just a bit of an observation on them, or at least this one. Here's some concept art of one of those structures found in the trailer. There's not too much to say about this one other than this one gives an idea of how large it is compared to what I assume is supposed to be Scorn Guy down there. Like, are they the equivalent for this planet of trees? Do they have a function? It's all unknown. There's also this picture, which the only really interesting thing I can point out is I have a feeling the two ones on the right were sort of copy and pasted and flipped around. Or maybe all of them actually were, and then a little bit of editing and adjustment was done over that to make it a bit less obvious. Like, perhaps that's intentional and these structures are supposed to be incredibly uniform. It's just something I sort of noticed when really trying to observe this particular concept art. I'm not exactly sure about what's going on in the background, particularly the top. It sort of looks like maybe a cave structure, actually, where that's sort of a rocky wall rather than these things being outside. But there's not really any sort of information that can really make that call accurately. It's just an interpretation. Now, speaking of indoor structures, here's a shot from the pre-alpha trailer where the Scorn devs first revealed their project, where they first tried to make a Kickstarter and it ultimately failed. The things I want you to pay attention to are, of course, a thing in the center. There's a bridge-like structure on the very top, and a bit difficult to see in the background to the right of the center structure is some sort of cylindrical structure with a red center. The developers have confirmed that this area will be in the final game. And here's a shot, or not a shot, but some concept art of the center structure. There's a few things that sort of grabbed my attention about it. One thing is you can sort of see some controlling mechanisms at the very top, some levers or something like that. I think for the game asset that was posted on ArtStation website, it was called the Command Center. But what really sort of interests me is the design of the machine parts, where it actually looks very different than the sort of design we've seen in the demo and the gameplay trailer and even the teaser trailer. Similar to, let's say, how Apple might have a very different look for its machinery than Microsoft, this machine and the machines in that area have a sort of different look and color palette and maybe even material usage than the ones we've seen in other media and shots of Scorn. It's also worth pointing out that this machinery is much more connected to organic looking stuff than the ones we've seen in the demo. The only really organic looking stuff connected to the machinery we've seen in the demo is the glove thing for the key upgrade station that has these organic tubes and weird heart mechanism attached to it. But this one has like just decayed bony structures running along it and serving as a foundation where the character will stand on for this structure. Here's the bridge part at the very top of the area. Once again, a lot of these rib-looking bony structures surrounding it. And there's two of these control mechanisms on top. And I'm not sure if Scorn Guy is large enough to be able to utilize both of them. I think these things are supposed to be utilized separately. But one of the things I kind of want to point out here is the background, which is just this green foggy mist, sort of. And for the picture of Scorn Guy looking at his hand decaying, I inquired whether or not he's in the outside environment. However, since we know based on the pictures I've shown of the actual level in the teaser trailer, this is clearly supposed to be inside. It could be that the green foggy background is just a generic background, since the focus of the picture is just a particular character or structure and they don't want your eyes to be wandering into anything unimportant. So I'm just mentioning that to say you can't really make any calls about what is and isn't with these concept arts sometimes. It could be a bit deceiving. And just to point something out, these structures are absolutely massive compared to Scorn Guy, which I assume is supposed to be about the height of the silhouette on the left side of the picture. One of the interesting parts about the crane, that this asset is called the crane, is that the very tip of it actually looks wooden. I've mentioned in the observations on the Scorn World video that the environment doesn't utilize wood or glass, and mentioned that as possible evidence that the game doesn't take place on Earth. But this, I think, might be an argument against that, assuming it really is wood. And here's a close-up of some assets from the very early development period of Scorn, like even the logo of the game was different, which I'll get into later. But you can see that a lot of it seems to be based on having this really thick webbing coating everything, and the overall design of that webbing is different than the one we've seen in the demo. In the demo it looks more like the red weed from War of the Worlds, while here it kind of looks like skin, or if you want to be less gruesome, let's say Swiss cheese coating everything. And here's another shot of the structure. This particular one was called the jacuzzi on the person's ArtStation page. Not really sure what that's supposed to mean as far as how it functions and what it's utilized for. But you can also see more of the webbing. Now I'm not sure if this webbing is specific to this area, or if it might have been a very early design of what would eventually be all the biological mass you find in the demo. But it's really become a part of the environment. And here's the actual model for the command center that's in the teaser trailer, and gives a little bit of a better idea of what the texturing is like. Again, the actual design of the machinery is very different. It looks like regular metal pipes rather than the more H.R. Giger-ish stuff we've seen before. And there's the bony structures. Kind of look like wood, actually, more than actual bones. And once again, it is very large. The vibe I get from it is that sort of cobbled together, more so than like meticulously built. The stuff in the demo looks like it was actually engineered, while here it kind of looks like they got what they could get from this wooden or whatever sort of material it is, and just really tried to tie it together with this wiring here, and then stuck a bunch of pipes into it. It looks a lot older and more decayed than the stuff we've seen in the demo and gameplay trailer as well, but that could be just a faulty interpretation of it all. Here's something called the Machine Execution, which is a bit of a frightening name, and the blood on it doesn't really help out at all either. Same deal, it has all this weird webby mass coating part of it. This one looks a bit more similar to the stuff we've seen in the demo, but still quite different. Not really sure what this thing is supposed to be used for and how it functions. All of this stuff actually in the pre-alpha trailer was part of an early demo the developers put together as a way to try to sell the project to potential publishers. However, as you probably know, none of them really took it on until much later. And we haven't seen any footage from the early demo since then, which is kind of unfortunate, because that seems like an interesting piece of the game's history that's essentially lost. Here's that cylindrical structure I mentioned much earlier on. The whole thing looks like it's stone or concrete that's since cracked with age, and in the center some fleshy material, but other than that there's really nothing I can gain or guess from this concept art. Like, is this supposed to be something Scorn guy can walk up on or something? Who knows? Now this one is from the newer reveal trailer rather than the pre-alpha trailer, but it still looks very similar to what we've seen before with the bony structures sticking out and the general color scheme even. I'm not sure how big this thing is supposed to be in the game based both on the concept art here and the trailer. I mean, the developers taking influence from HR Gear, part of it looks like some really demented vagina. There's some fleshy center with an approximate outline of a humanoid form sort of ending down at the waist without any legs or feet, and the fleshy part there ends further down with a large tentacle sticking out. There's really not much that can be guessed or garnered from this, unfortunately, but it does seem like something that might be important or significant in the game itself. Here's a collection of concept arts, two of which we've already seen, and one of which I'll show you later on. But the one I really want you to pay attention to is the top right. That crater structure there, I'm not sure how big it's supposed to be. It could be the entire area part of the game takes place in, or it just could be one aspect of the puzzles. But I've never seen that particular artwork alone. It's only been shown with these other artworks in this little collage here. And here's just a picture of Scorn guy standing around between two drippy walls of flesh. This part actually looks a lot wetter than any part we've seen in the other images and videos. And I'm wondering if the orange glow that's sort of illuminating him is supposed to be from the outside, considering what we know the outside looks like from the gameplay trailer. This is, as far as I can tell, the earliest concept art for the game that I know of. According to Stray Child here on DeviantArt, it was drawn in 2013, and it is indeed for the game Scorn. The environments are much fleshier than the ones we've seen in not only the current stuff like the gameplay trailer and the demo, but also even the pre-alpha build. It really looks like everything is draped in skin and flesh. And it's also interesting that the background, the sky, looks closer to, say, a rainy, crappy day on Earth than the one we've seen in the gameplay trailer. I think it might be because the developers asked this guy just to draw some structures for the game and not focus too much on what the sky looks like. Additionally, you can see the sort of bridge part on the top of the structure that looks very similar aesthetically to the bridge structure seen in the pre-alpha trailer. So this whole area might be the same general area, or the sort of design and aesthetic they were really thinking about when first creating the game. And here's another environment. Again, a lot of really fleshy structures, again from 2013. This person has also posted other environmental concept arts, but have mentioned in the description that they're non-required concept arts for the Scorn game. So I'm not sure if those were even planned to be utilized, or if they were just ones that he drew for fun because he really liked drawing this stuff. it is interesting to see such a very different look as far as concept art goes to what we've seen most of the time. I think I'll end this part on the early concept arts of the environment with this one, which is, in my opinion, the most interesting of them all, because of just how Earth-like it looks. Skies covered in clouds, and unlike the pictures I've shown you before, this picture is very clearly heavily focused on the sky and the scenery, so there's not really the assumption that can be made that the artist just threw that together because they were focusing on other things and didn't really want to waste time on what the clouds should look like. There's mountains. It's a bit hard to see in the YouTube video, but there's sections of it on the left side that kind of look like a ravine, but could also just be shadows from mountainous areas. There's dips in elevation. In the far background are just a bunch of mountains. It looks like something from Earth. It really does. Like, even the part where he's standing on looks rocky rather than anything flesh-based. And of course, the color palette is very different than what we've seen in the gameplay trailer. A lot of the early concept arts and even some of the current concept arts have a very green-heavy color palette, but I'd assume that for the environment they try to stick as close to what it looks like or will look like in the final game as possible. In the newer concept arts, the environment looks much closer to what we've seen in the gameplay trailer, with the sky and surrounding landscape being very orange and yellow. The interesting thing about this decayed building here is that it decayed very similarly to how the creatures decay in the game. Like, if you think back to the creature with its head ripped off, this looks like one of the stages it would have sort of broken down like. That might be one of the ways the developers are sort of blurring the lines between organic stuff and machinery. Both of them wither away in the exact same manner. And here's another very current concept art. It has a red weed everywhere, which is a lot closer to what we've seen these days and before, and the overall design of the machinery is a lot closer to what we've seen in the recent material than what we've been looking at over the last 20 or so minutes. This picture I showed a few times in the speculations or observations on the World of Scorn video, just highlighting the fact that the Scorn people have no real regard for their safety. But another interesting thing about this is the entire environment, other than those metal bars and what might be windows or pipes, is fleshy. Everywhere else, even the pre-alpha stuff, it looks like things were mostly supposed to be mechanical or stone. In the gameplay demo, it's either this sort of factory metal setting or just a rocky underground area, but here it's like the entire place is coated in some sort of flesh. The tubes running from the walls and ceilings are made of flesh. Like, a lot of people have pointed out just how fleshy the game looks like, but we've seen throughout this whole video that the environments are not fleshy at all, which makes this an extreme outlier. This area has 2 control panels rather than 1. I think this is supposed to be some sort of puzzle that'll be done in the game, You have to figure out how to manipulate this fluid, which, for whatever reason, there's a bunch of openings in the pipe for it to spill out. The two websites I've seen the developers post on are DeviantArt and ArtStation, which makes sense since they're both websites dedicated to art. If you look up Scorn on ArtStation, you'll see quite a few pictures that look very Scorn-like. A few of them, the people admitted that the pictures are inspired by Scorn, but aren't actually for the game itself. And some of them, the people who posted them have mentioned specifically that they've worked with the developers of Scorn on it. The pictures I'll show you here were posted by a guy called Tom Stefanovsky. It's a bit difficult to read out these names. And he isn't credited on any of the Kickstarters or websites for Scorn. However, neither is Martin de Diego, whose own ArtStation page he shows the processes he went through with designing the Scorn's logo. Developers have mentioned that they've worked with quite a few artists and concept artists outside of just the ones that are credited with on the Kickstarter and websites. So I'm saying all of this because it's very much in the air whether or not this stuff that I'm going to show you by this guy is actually going to be part of the game. It's tagged under Scorn, some of them are tagged under game characters and video game environments, but you will see that this is the closest we'll get to looking like the stuff we've seen so far in the game. So if this guy really did work on Scorn, it reveals quite a lot with what we can actually expect. So let's begin with this. This one here is called Scorned Creature, and it might look a little bit familiar. It looks similar to the bears and the kiwis in its overall design. Its head doesn't have eyes or a mouth, but seems to split away at the top. However, for this creature, the top part is completely closed, and unlike any of the other variants in that design we've seen, it actually has hair on it, which might be a bit difficult to see on YouTube. On its back and running down its spine are openings that have fleshy mass in them. It's a lot darker and less red than the ones we've seen before. It has 3 fingers instead of the 4 on the bear and kiwi. On the bear and kiwi, 2 of them are fused together, but there still were once separate fingers. On its chest is a tentacle poking out, kinda similar to the tentacles that poke out of the bear's chest. And one interesting thing is that around that area are these sort of, I guess you can say, broken up a bit, or ridges, that aren't really found on any of the other variants. Like, this one looks remarkably different than what we've seen before, and this was posted to ArtStation at 2017. So, assuming this guy posts his recent work, this would be in the realm of the newer designs rather than the old ones we were reviewing sometime earlier. So very interesting, and as I said before, this is the most familiar thing he's posted. This is called Organic Drone. It's also posted under the Scorn tag, and it is very, very different than anything we have seen so far. Additionally, in the tags, there's worker and scavenger, which gives a bit of an idea of what it might be for. But just to point out, the top of it has these sort of mesh structures, very, very clearly metal, similar to what we have on Earth, rather than anything we've seen in the Scorn universe. Like this, that particular material and the way it's used is not seen anywhere else. Its body is black, unlike a lot of the bodies of machinery and creatures we've seen in other materials and concept arts of the game. And there's all these very bright lights coming off of it. I'm really not entirely sure where this machine fits into the rest of the Scorn universe, if it is part of it. Like, again, it's unknown for certain or not if this person actually worked with the developers or if this is all inspired by Scorn. But let's show some other stuff and then we'll talk about it. This one here is called the game character. Once again, it is tagged under Scorn. It's also tagged under drone and biosuit. So I'm assuming this is some sort of organic suit, maybe similar to the one we've seen so far, but aesthetically, from a design standpoint, very different than what we've seen so far. Completely black, has small bright lights on it. It seems to function more like a conventional suit we have in our own universe than the one in the Scorn universe, and I base this off of the sort of transparent parts on its legs and abdomen, which kind of looks like you can see the wearer's legs under it, which would indicate it's a separate thing rather than sort of meshed or molded in with the wearer's flesh. And here's a bit of a close-up of its face. It has a sort of smooth, very shiny hexagonal pattern rather than a transparent, fleshy and veiny pattern like we've seen with the Scorn guy pictures. And it is sort of designed organically. Like the chest area has sort of parts that resemble the ribs and stuff, and the back of it has its own sort of ridges running along it. But once again, I gotta stress just how different this is from what we're used to. Aside from all of that, the suit itself is still symmetrical. One side is essentially the same on the other. I'm really wondering if this might be like a separate faction or a separate culture that can be found in the Scorn universe. Like in some areas they went with a more bony look to things, in other areas they went with more just fleshy organic stuff, and here they went with much darker material with lights on it. This one is called the Alien Scout. It's also tagged under Scorn. And similar to Scorn Guy, it doesn't have a mouth. But unlike Scorn Guy, it doesn't really have much of anything. It doesn't have eyes in its sockets. The sides of its head are those sort of ridge structures. Similar to Scorn Guy, you can sort of see its muscles on its shoulders and chest. But this might indicate that there's very different humanoid creatures even closer to how Scorn Guy looks than the one we've seen in the pod in the reveal trailer walking around in the game. This one is called Alien Dissector. In addition to being tagged as part of Scorn, it's also tagged as Doctor and of course Dissector. In one of the interviews with Peklar, the lead developer, he mentioned that he asked people to draw concept art for the game, and when they started focusing on having like eyes and a bunch of teeth and an overall insect design, that was sort of when he realized they were sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel and were running out of good ideas. Which is interesting because this is a very insect-like design. And yet, assuming this person, again, is actually working on Scorn and this isn't something inspired by it, or maybe even just a rejected idea from it, this would be a very insect-like alien to find. And also very different structurally than anything we've seen so far. I suppose that's just a running theme with the artwork this guy has posted. Now, throughout viewing this person's art, I made it a point to mention that it's actually tagged as Scorn. And the reason for that is because a few of his arts, such as this one called Alien Queen, aren't tagged under Scorn, but still look very similar to the stuff that was tagged under Scorn. Now, a few of the people who made art and assets for the Scorn game have also done other things of similar nature to what they worked on with Scorn for fun, but considering just how incredibly different this person's stuff is from what we've seen so far and what sort of doors it would open toward theorizing and coming up with or trying to figure out the lore of the game, I think it might be good to also post this untagged stuff in the off chance that it actually is going to be part of the game. Here's another thing that looks kind of like the prawns from District 9, very insect-like, and yet it still has the sort of ridge structures we've seen in this guy's previous work and a few environments in the confirmed things for Scorn. This one is called Organic Acid. It actually is tagged under Scorn, and you can see it's sort of maybe a rocky substance with perhaps some sort of webbing-like coating, very thin, and a part of it is luminescent but still has some coating over it. This one is called Alien Planet Environment, and it's not tagged under Scorn, but you can see a lot of the structures are very similar in nature to the organic asset I showed before it, where there's sort of a bony part of it and then some part of it that's lit up and still it has webbing coating over it. It looks closer to a fantasy civilization than what we've seen in Scorn so far. And yet it also looks very close to the game character model that was tagged with Scorn, especially the bottom picture, which has a mostly black structure with smaller white lights over it. A lot of this stuff seems very artificial, or like it was constructed rather than grown naturally, especially since there's an arch with a light hanging down under it, or what might be some sort of equivalent of street lights for the top picture. Those mounds there could probably be buildings of some sort for all we know. And here's another shot of it. The top one, and the bottom one for that matter, What's interesting about this area is it looks like it has grass in it or some sort of more plant-like foliage than what we've seen in other videos and drawings of Scorn. Maybe it's sort of like wheat in some ways. The bottom one gives a better shot of the arches and the buildings, and also the wall in the background, which look very organic in some ways. It's not rocky in the way we'd find on Earth, but looks a lot more alien, which I guess fits alien planet environment. This area seems to take place in some sort of enclosed crater where the only entrance is through a cave, and it also takes place at night under a starry sky. It's not tagged under Scorn, but considering how similar it is to the stuff that is tagged under Scorn, I think it really is worth showing. If this really is a part of the Scorn game, this is one of the environments that can be found in it, then that would really show that there are very different cultures and technologies in the Scorn universe, similar to how there's very different cultures and designs of technology in our own universe. The real unfortunate part is I don't know how to get into contact with this guy. There's not like an email on his ArtStation page, and looking up his name and trying to find any sort of connection between him and Ebb Software hasn't proved very fruitful at all. So you can probably take this whole section of his art with a grain of salt as to whether or not it'll actually be in the game, or if it was just inspired by the game. Here's something that looks a bit closer to what we're familiar with. It's called Scorn Cart Asset, and it's posted by George. I have no idea how to pronounce it. DJ ORDJE Lysick. The person specifically mentioned it's a collaboration with Ebb Software, so there's no ambiguity as to whether or not this is supposed to be a part of Scorn. And despite looking closer to what we've seen so far, there's still quite a few differences that I think should be pointed out. One of them is the color palette. It's mostly green and red and a bit of white, which is very different than the color palette we've seen otherwise, which is a sort of brown and white and yellow for the pre-alpha stuff, or the more metallic gray, green, and I guess somewhat red for the gameplay trailer and demo and that stuff. The materials for this thing is also pretty different. It looks like it's coated in felt rather than flesh. Like, yeah, the whole thing is designed to sort of look organic, but the actual thing itself, based on the textures, isn't organic. The green part is felt, and the white part looks like clay or ceramic, and the red part sort of looks like it's a very soft material as well. The cart is composed of two separate parts. The previous part I showed you fitting down snugly into this part here, like stacking two bowls together. There's not much that can be said about this part that couldn't be said about the previous one, but I'm guessing in the game itself you might have to assemble the cart before you can use it. It's interesting that this cart doesn't seem to have any wheels on it though, whether it's simply because the person who sculpted it decided not to add wheels, or the thing is supposed to be guided along on some rail using that structure below it, or who knows, maybe it's even hovers in the air. As for what this cart is supposed to carry, that's a real interesting question, because it doesn't look like a very conventional cart. It's probably supposed to carry some tall cylindrical structure, given the previous picture, the two prongs sort of hugging around at the middle of it. In any case, this is pretty much the only thing we've seen of this particular design using this color scheme and materials. So I'm not sure if this will be like maybe a separate area with its own aesthetic and culture like we've seen with a previous artist, or it might be a failed concept that ultimately doesn't make it into the game, or it might just be incorporated in some way to the more familiar stuff we've seen in the demo and gameplay trailer. But all things considered, I do quite like it. Another thing to point out is just how clean it looks. Like, sure, the felt part looks a bit torn up, but looks in no way as decayed and broken as a lot of the stuff we've seen in the other concept arts. One of the things you really have to keep in mind is that what's actually shown in the drawings won't necessarily translate to what the thing actually will look like in the final result. Because while this is very clearly the area in the reveal trailer that the character sort of walks around through holding his gun out, where you see a close-up of his body, the color palette of this is very, very different than what we've seen in the trailer. There is a lot of green in this, that's simply completely missing from the trailer. But other than that, it looks fairly accurate to what we've seen in the trailer. I'm wondering if this area is supposed to be like outside and is a bridge between two structures or buildings, or what's exactly going on behind these curvy bars here. The ground, actually, I should point out, is very similar in design to what we've seen with the pre-alpha trailer, where it's very bony and has these rib structures on it, rather than the ground we've seen in the demo and gameplay trailer. So this might be like the connection between the two areas, or maybe some evidence that they're both designed by the same people, but one part, maybe for utilitarian purposes, has one aesthetic and another part has a different aesthetic. Here's a lamp and a model based on the concept art, which there's a few differences between the drawing and the asset, but ultimately it's still the same structure and looks a lot closer to what we've seen in the demo than anything else. There's not too much else to say about it. It does have that sphere down there that kind of reminds me of the one on the console that you use to upgrade the stone key, but might just look similar and not function at all similar. Here's a machine that, according to the developers, will be used a bunch of times in the game. Just to be an asshole, I will say that it is actually in the game files, and its purpose is abundantly clear, but I'm not going to tell you. Instead, I'm just going to say, with a little bit of a hint, that's something that people have been bitching about in regards to the demo. But since this is supposed to be in the area that the demo takes place in, there's not too much to really speculate on as far as who built it or where it's supposed to be in the Scorn's universe. But if it is found throughout the game, then that would imply a sort of unified society, even despite the very different looks of each area. Like if that really sort of fantasy-like area I talked about earlier actually is in the game, this machine would be found in that area and it would really stick out among it. Here's some various designs for the logo that ultimately didn't end up as a final design for it. The artist mentioned that Peklar specifically wanted the O to be very extravagant or really stick out, which is kind of funny because the final design, the O blends completely in with the other letters. In fact, the R looks a lot more interesting than what the O turned out to be. And here's a shot of Scorn Guy's back, but more significantly for this part, the early version of the logo. And what's nice about this one is it's actually in color, so you can see the tentacle parts all sort of came out and circled around the O part, which makes it far more significant than anything else. The actual way the tentacle parts sort of curve out, even if they're not exactly so, are still fairly symmetrical. And also sort of implies that even as far back as the pre-alpha days, the developer seemed to have an idea that it would involve this red weed corrupting things. And I think this, more than most things, sort of implies that all that fleshy stuff isn't supposed to be there and it's a problem in the universe. Something happened where flesh just got out of control and started covering everything up, assimilating everything into it, even the non-organic stuff. At least that seems to be what's happening to poor Scorn Guy here, which is a picture I'm going to end this rather long video at this point on. This is actually my favorite picture from the Scorn game, and there's a few things to note about here. The top of his head looks much more like a bony structure than what we've seen so far, where it looks like it's covered in skin. The red part wrapping around its face is a lot more solid than what we've seen in other concept arts. He seems to be hollow in this picture. His body is decaying away at his chest area or his abdomen area and replaced by a red weed mesh structure, sort of similar to the decay process we've seen earlier, but also a little bit different. It's not just red stuff coating him, but also yellow threads coating his body. That part seems to be more centered around his arm and his torso, and a little bit around his head. I'm wondering if that's a separate thing from the red stuff coating him, or if that's maybe just part of his body fusing together and then decaying away. The background of it isn't yellow or orange like we've seen before. It's actually a lot closer to the backgrounds we've seen in some of the other concept arts of the outside. So I'm wondering if that area in the gameplay trailer, the outside shots we've seen, is sort of an outlier rather than what we can really expect the entire planet to look like, or even a huge section of where we explore the game on the outside to look like. There's just something very depressing about this picture. Like, this guy is in a position where he just totally failed and isn't able to move forward, which makes some sense. as he's sitting on some singular platform, potentially high above the ground, with nothing else in sight. It's completely obscured by fog, or maybe even it's so high it's obscured by the clouds. He just sort of sat down and gave up, allowing the environment to engulf him, just as it's done for everything else we've seen in a lot of the materials. We don't really know what he was trying to do in the game, or where he came from, or what he was thinking the end result would be. But whatever it was, he failed. Being Scorn Guy is suffering. So I hope this video was entertaining and gave you something to think about. I tried to show off the most interesting concept arts and really give an idea of what it might imply for the rest of the Scorn universe. Hopefully, as time goes on and the months go on, the developers will release more concept arts or pictures from the game to speculate on, since that's as much as we can really do, considering there's not any actual plot for the game that we know of. Take care.